Was that about the time that you started with the FBI cyber division?
The end of the Obama administration, the beginning of the Trump administration, I was actually a daily intelligence briefer.
When you talk about how they targeted elections, what do you mean by that?
Pictures of election officials, pictures of where their houses were, crosshairs over their faces. It was awful.
Why specifically ransomware? Is that the new crime of our era?
This isn't just crime on a computer. It's costing people lives.
Cynthia, thank you so much for doing this. Before we start, do you mind taking a minute to introduce yourself and what you do, and making sure to spend a moment on your background in the FBI cyber division as well?
Of course. My name's Cynthia Kaiser, and I'm currently a senior vice president who is leading Halcyon's Ransomware Research Center. I came to Halcyon a few months ago after a 20-year career with the FBI, where I spent the majority of my time over cyber threat intelligence, predominantly looking at how to make intelligence and analysis of the myriad cyber threats that are facing the nation, then translate that into stories, into action steps that can be taken, and into ways to really counter criminals.
I guess the place I want to start is back in 2016, 2017, the end of the election cycle, the beginning of the Trump presidency. Where were you in your career? Was that about the time that you started with the FBI cyber division?
It was about the time. So during the end of the Obama administration, the beginning of the Trump administration, I was actually a daily intelligence briefer for both administrations at that time. And as a part of being there, there were some really pivotal cyber issues, right? Cyber threats that came up, not just related to the election, like so many different cyber threats that were coming up over that kind of year and a half long cycle, that gave me a front seat to how the US was shaping its response and policy towards cyber threats, and looking into the eyes of people who, for all accounts, wield a lot of power on the international stage, and having them be afraid of what criminals thousands of miles away were doing on a keyboard. I knew there was nothing I wanted to do more than come back to FBI cyber, counter cyber threats. I felt it in my bones. It was the national security challenge of our lifetime.
The common refrain that you're hearing over and over these days is that whatever election interference might have occurred from third-party threat actors at that time was standard fare for elections, that's a common feature of elections and has been for a long time. Is that your perspective? Or was there anything that felt like it was out of the ordinary, disproportionate to you guys at the time?
Yeah, the actual targeting of election infrastructure, so the actual targeting of various counties and how they were conducting their elections. Now, none of that activity was proven to, or really had the access to try to change votes per se, but that targeting, the looking at, the really trying to identify how do they get in and learn more about the internal workings of exactly how we conduct elections, that's different, right? Because given additional accesses, additional time to try to figure out what they were really looking for, and that can have really negative effects. And they can also lie about those effects to try to, once again, pit people against each other. So that's what was really striking, I think, in that time period.
Follow-up question. When you talk about how they targeted elections, what do you mean by that? Do you mean they targeted certain jurisdictions? They targeted certain technology? What do you mean by that?
They specifically targeted the state and local election infrastructure that is used by those governments to administer elections.
Are you able to talk a little bit more specific about what those activities were? I think our audience would be curious about that.
Yeah, so in 2020, Iran had done some really distinct targeting efforts against elections. They had gone and attempted, at least done some research into getting into, once again, election infrastructure. They had been able to identify some vulnerabilities in uh, websites. So not necessarily like doing some sophisticated intrusion, but they were able to, figure out ways to get certain information if it was exposed to the internet. And they used all that information, they mixed it with lies, and they tried to create different campaigns that targeted different ends of the political spectrum. So they weren't targeting one or the other. What they were doing is trying to set people up to fight each other. And you saw them putting out threatening email messages to various voters, threatening them not to vote. You saw them putting out videos claiming that they have conducted intrusions into election infrastructure and hacked votes. They hadn't. And that was all part of a cyber group that was doing this. And so they weren't necessarily as skilled or as experienced in the actual trying to shape perceptions into operations. They're doing things a little more aggressively. They weren't really hiding their hand all as much as they think they thought they were. And and that's what bore out, and likely why we could see some of the activity they were doing. But because this was so aggressive and emotional, they didn't even stop there. The government, like, we've been able to get out messaging within, I think, 48 hours about the operations, because no one wants to retweet Iran, no matter what you believe. If you know it's Iran, you're going to be more circumspect about all of the information. But even after the election, they were then trying to put out lists of people to target, like physically target on the internet, pictures of election officials, pictures of where their houses were, having crosshairs over their faces. It was awful. Not necessarily a cyber intrusion, right? But this mixture of, they'd use cyber intrusions to fuel their lies early in the election, before the election, and then after the election, use some of that infrastructure then to lie more, try to continue to sow that chaos. So you can see how messy it is, right? It almost feels unorganized when I'm talking about it, because you're like, you have people over here, you have them over there, and the way I envision it, this is not based on any classified information, is you had a bunch of people around a table just throwing ideas out there, and like someone running off and doing it, right? It's how it felt. It felt so ad hoc and haphazard. But then, they were causing real problems for people as a result.
Did it feel like what you were dealing with at the time was out of the ordinary, that it had escalated past what it had ever been before?
Yes, with an asterisk, because it's felt like that in almost every new cyber campaign that we've dealt with since as well. There's a lot of innovation on the cyber threat actor side that sometimes you don't see in other types of criminals, other types of nefarious actors. And so it was really a time where we saw actors doing something different, but then we moved on. And if you looked at just like a year and a half-ish later, we had a Russian campaign that was targeting the energy sector. If you keep going forward, you had Chinese campaigns that had infected over 10,000 workstations. In cyber, it's always this new weird escalation that you hadn't anticipated before.
Interesting. What were the biggest cases that you worked while you were there that took up the most of your time and attention?
The response to Colonial pipeline, which was a ransomware attack against a pipeline, really, it was an attack against the business network, but it had effects across all of its operating, which meant it was hard for people to get gas for a few days. And that, I think, highlighted for people what a significant issue even criminals using cyber intrusions, like what effect they could have. And that caused a very large apparatus to be spun up around how do you counter ransomware? Like, how do you really address this new and emerging threat? And so, that feels big, not just because it's these visible consequences, people are lining up at gas stations, but the reverberations of that, like, how are we going to tackle this? What are we going to do? Obviously, that takes up a lot of our space, time, and really thinking through it. But there have been other major campaigns by most of the bad guys you can think of. Russian targeting of the energy sector. There was SolarWinds, which was a Russian campaign that compromised a software supplier. Because they were able to do that early, it enabled them to have access to just thousands and thousands of networks. You had Chinese campaigns on something called Hafnium, where they used a 0-day, which is a vulnerability that the public doesn't know about, maybe like the manufacturer doesn't even know about. They got onto over 10,000 workstations just here in the US, and they put in a backdoor so they could come back later and do more, figure out more about what's going on those networks. Even just fast forwarding then to some of my last few months at the FBI, we were dealing with Salt Typhoon compromises, which was wide compromises into US telecommunications infrastructure by the Chinese. And so you can see I'm ticking off thing after thing after thing. Each one was a little different. It caused us to have to address it differently, think about it differently, counter it differently. It's not a plug and play response book. You really have to use like all the expertise that you've developed, but also a lot of creativity to figure out the best way to stop the attacks from happening, or at least try to help people get back online.
I know you just said a moment ago it's not plug and play, but what is the process that you guys use when you approach these?
I will take one example of what I think is more ideal in terms of how we approach them, because a lot of this is going to depend on how the information comes in to the FBI and like what stage a campaign's at. In a recent one, we received a tip from industry. The back and forth, like two-way flow of information between government and industry is so critical to being able to counter the threats, because industry has different types of access and are going to see different things than the government does. So there was a tip from industry. Hey, this looks weird. This IP address, it is doing things against certain types of victims that we think has broader consequences, but that industry partner really could only see what their kind of customer base was like telling them. So when FBI takes that, they start building up information around that using legal process, like trying to identify what might be going on. I think you've probably heard in Intel operations before, finding a needle in a haystack. In cyber operations, you have to build the haystack before you can even look to find the needle. So they're doing legal process. They're trying to identify what might be happening from some of this infrastructure. They're identifying infrastructure that might be connected. Okay, so they have to do more legal process, try to get more information. And through legal process, FBI is often able to obtain some more contextual information than industry may have, like more just data type information. And ultimately, the FBI is able to identify, hey, there's a much broader problem here. We can see what these malicious actors actually stole. It says that there's probably a broader problem. We're going to go back and go to the victims. No one cared about emails that went to suppliers last Tuesday. It was like the data right underneath that really helped identify malicious activity. Being able to identify that information so that you could put out unclassified notices really helped. And I want to dive in on that because I'm really proud of the work that the FBI did from the time I came on board to the time I left, which was about 8 years. We'd gone from just a handful of unclassified notices that went out to net defenders, to almost 100. And that was huge. That wasn't just me, right? That was everybody involved. That was the moment of the time. That was really this refocusing the efforts to not just be, hey, we have to build a law enforcement case. It was much more about, hey, we have to counter these adversaries, and countering means defense, countering means partnering with industry, partnering with other agencies, other countries. And how do we really figure out how we can have the best effect? Now, throughout that process that I just noted, it's not like they took it from industry, said, thank you very much, and then never talked to them again. It was a constant back and forth. We found this looks like infrastructure. Are you seeing this here? But they had these back and forth conversations so that we could build out the threat picture together. And I think that's the ideal. The ideal kind of playbook is tipping and queuing across different parties who have more information. In the US, that looks like industry and government, but cyber actors don't care about borders. So it also, I think, means a lot more chipping and queuing with international like-minded partners.
Because of the other projects that we work on, we do also talk to a lot of hackers. They don't have a lot of restrictions that a federal bureaucracy might have, right? I mean, they don't have protocols and rules and processes and things like that, and it's messy. Is it challenging to try to track and combat the newest, hottest threats right now when you're inside of this battleship that's as challenging to turn as federal law enforcement?
I think the bigger issue now isn't so much as, oh, we don't have the right rules or we don't have the right abilities, but the scale and scope of what's occurring make it really hard for law enforcement to keep up with anything but the really big threats, because you have just so many different groups proliferating in cyberspace. And if you have to really have niche understanding of how to creative apply the approaches and use experience to be your guide to help you solve this new type of challenge, and then still stay up on all the new technology that's coming out, all the new ways to attack, that's hard, and it's hard to scale.
How does the Bureau prioritize what it's going to focus on? Because I imagine the incoming calls are just never ending. I imagine there's just like a constant stream in of reports of things that have been compromised, of potential vulnerabilities. How do you decide?
The FBI had a way to prioritize threats that was done across all the different programs. So first, it kind of started with, is China a bigger threat than Iran, right? Having those kind of conversations. And then we let the experts be experts, and they would dive in deep then on what the various groups in some of these threats were and identify what would have the biggest effect if we were able to counter them, and then started to put the kind of bigger amounts of effort towards those.
Do you also find, or have you found during your tenure, that the attitudes from hackers on government agencies, on federal law enforcement, have evolved with time, and specifically recently? And I bring that up because we covered DARPA's AI Cyber Challenge at DEF CON this year, and we interviewed a number of young attendees at DEF CON, and everybody was super positive about collaborations with the government. And a lot of young people going into the world are specifically going in for job opportunities. And a lot of them are not distinguishing between a government job and a private industry. They're just looking for the best entry point. And I think it's leading to this world where, the old school attitude, anti-establishment attitude of the hackers kind of disappearing a little bit.
I think that's because there's real enemies, right? There's real threats. And if you're in government or if you're in industry, you get to counter these real existing threats to not just your country, but like cyber threats affect your friends, they affect your family, they affect the communities you live in. There's a lot of crimes that I'm sure people that are tuning in here have heard about, but they don't know any victims of. My guess is everybody knows somebody that's been a victim of a cyber crime. And so I think part of it's that the mindset shift is that this is a problem for people I love, and I need to do something about it. And the relationship between government and industry, where it is this tipping and queuing, this back and forth, it has allowed people to go in and out of government that makes us safer. I used to do a lot of recruiting among students when I was at the FBI. And one thing I used to tell people is that there's nothing wrong that with choosing the government mission in your 20s and choosing money in your 30s. And it doesn't mean you're really giving up the mission either way, but you can go back and forth. That you're not set on a life sentence if you join at 22. And so getting to do having access to really cool training, really cool tech, and really interesting ways in which they can work with teams to counter adversaries. I don't know if those are unique to government or industry anymore. And I think that's really what's the difference now.
That seems like the perfect pivot point to talk about the now. So why did you decide to make that career transition? Obviously, during your tenure with the FBI, which was 20 years or something like that?
Mm-hmm. He was.
You built a long established career, and part of that, at least during the latter part, was working on some of the kind of threats that you are now full-time focused on. So why the pivot?
I knew that I wanted to go to industry, um, even as early as just a few years ago, because I feel like the best practitioners in our space have experience in both. There's insights that you get when you're in an industry, and that's technical insights, that's insights into conversations with CISOs, chief information officers, you name it, that you're just not going to get when you're on the government side. And so, I feel like learning all those different perspectives, knowing what we can do from either side is important. I was very interested in pivoting to a job, though, that made me feel like I was part of the mission.
Well, tell me about the mission. What's your day-to-day? What's the focus?
So I am building a ransomware research center for a startup called Halcyon, which is a platform that helps effectively stop ransomware identified early on up through stop an attack from actually occurring. So my focus is on doing that, not just with inside resources at Halcyon, though there are like a lot of really amazing experts. It's really fun to work with, but trying to unite experts and defenders across industry, partner with people in industry, partner Halcyon with the government on ransomware, and bring people working ransomware together, bring the intelligence together to have more comprehensive intelligence and analysis focused on being able to create actionable steps to counter ransomware, whether that's defensive or whether that's proactive.
You obviously have a very broad skill set and set of experience that you could have pointed at any number of different directions. Why specifically did you choose ransomware? Is that the new crime of our era? Is that the most destructive thing that hackers can do today? Why that?
It's the attack that is most prevalent. It's affecting most people. And so I wanted to be able to work towards helping as many people as I could. And I felt like countering ransomware was where that was at. And I saw a lot in the government of nation state actors who were either using proxies or pretending to be the criminals themselves to conduct their activities. And so, kind of almost hiding behind this cybercrime veneer, that it created some confusion about attribution. And so we saw that in a few years ago in Iran's attack of Albania. And, you saw that even recently with some Chinese espionage campaigns that ended in ransomware attacks. So to me, it was a type of crime, it was a type of cyber attack that was impacting everybody. It's where some more creativity actually occurs. If you talked about the hacker culture, right? And hey, they're able to pivot and go all over and do all these things, but the government, maybe they are slower or they can't catch up. But like that's the same. The same is true for nation states, just overall. They're not different than the U.S. government. They're still bureaucracies. Ransomware actors, cybercrime, are the startups of the cyber operations ecosystem. And so getting to do this work means that I am countering the threats affecting more people, that I think we can really work with companies to identify like how to counter them, that there's the will to counter it. And you get to work and encounter some really sophisticated technical work or innovative creative work. And that to me is so important to countering all of the cyber operations across the board.
I assume a lot of this is probably under the cone of confidentiality, but on the front lines, are there any new trends that you're spotting in these ransomware attacks?
We've seen ransomware actors really targeting and coming up with new ways to get to manipulate identity or authentication to get onto networks. And peeling that back, what that means is being able to identify the username and passwords that people use to get on, taking over certain accounts when they get onto a network, creating their own username and password like they're a user themselves, and trying to also like very sophisticatedly get around multi-factor authentication. So you know how like you're signing into a website and then you get a push text and it's like, here's your code, and you have to put in your code. That's important. That's better than nothing. Some of the more advanced ransomware actors have figured out how to intercept that code. And so we've been really talking to organizations about putting in something called phishing resistant multi-factor authentication. So think like you have an authenticator app, like you have the app on your phone instead of the push text or push call. So that's kind of one bucket. Second bucket, do see some more actors really using 0 days to get on board. So get onto a system. That means they've identified vulnerabilities that no one else knows about, and they've either sold those to multiple ransomware groups, and lots of ransomware groups are using them, or kept it for themselves and try to get on. And then third is through third parties. So calling and compromising a person at the third party service, say a call center that a company is using, and paying them off or coercing them into getting them greater access to clients. So those are kind of the three ways in which we see actors getting onto systems. Of course, there's other trends that we're seeing across the board. I mentioned nation states masquerading as ransomware. We're seeing some incorporation of AI, which I'm happy to get into. But I always focus a lot of my talks on how they get in, because if you can stop them from getting in, you can stop the damage from happening in the first place.
Yeah, that's probably a very interesting part of your sales pitch and your communications for the company when you're talking to these different prospective partners, right? But I imagine that it's hard to get people to be proactive rather than reactive. Or are people getting better at that in 2025? I don't know.
There's been so many improvements across everybody and what they've been able to get onto systems, like people taking cybersecurity more seriously. And like the really frustrating thing, like I can't imagine being a CIO or a CISO right now, and you've done all the right things, you put it all into place, but it's like an arms race, right? You put up a wall and adversaries figure out ways to get around that wall. And so you have to keep adding more and more to systems. And like, that's just the reality, even though it's frustrating. I think that's why I'm excited about AI based behavior detection, because it doesn't just kind of rely on like one type of technology, like one type of signature to stop adversaries from getting on. It can say, this feels weird, this user's acting different, this doesn't make sense to me, and identify activity that way. And I think that's going to enable organizations to hopefully have to stop this kind of purchase then purchase a new thing next year, purchase a new thing work. But certainly I can feel for anyone in the shoes of trying to protect a network nowadays.
Can we double click into the AI? Take us there. Are you
Right.
also seeing AI used on the threat side? Some of the people I've spoken with have talked about AI bots being used to defeat multi-factor authentication, CAPTCHAs, any variety of things. What are you seeing on the threat side? And then talk a little bit more about how you're integrating AI into your process.
So first off, I think that the benefits of AI are still weighted towards cybersecurity rather than adversaries' use of it. But adversaries are absolutely using AI. It's mostly in those early stages. So being able to vastly increase the volume and sophistication of phishing emails that are coming over, or the CAPTCHA, getting around CAPTCHA, or getting around multi-factor authentication, as you noted, um, being able to create fake calls or videos that get onto networks that maybe don't have security flaws. So if your CEO calls you and it's in a messaging app, you normally talk to your CEO in, and if they're at the vacation house that you've seen them at before, and they say, this is really, hey, I need you to get on this call with some buyers, or something, right? Some kind of urgency, some kind of situation, and they send you a link, you're probably going to click on the link. And that's a real example of where an adversary has tricked an employee.
And how an assistant lost a job as well. That's
Yeah, exactly. Some of the other areas besides kind of getting onto systems more easily that we see them incorporating is learning user behavior so they can mimic it. So identifying when users are online so that they're not conducting activity in off hours that makes it more suspicious to net defenders, identifying how and what might be the most valuable information on a network. They can do that by a few different ways. While you're on the system, maybe they're using certain types of AI to make it easier, but really pulling information off a system and then using a large language model, just like we would use ChatGPT, to comb through the information to find what might be most valuable. And that's something we can all imagine AI that adversaries can use AI to do today. And what I worry more about is something that we haven't necessarily seen actors do yet, but could come in the future, which is developing like intelligent malware. Effectively, malware, when it gets onto a system, it can learn and adapt itself to get around security blocks more easily. We're not really necessarily there that much yet. We've seen adversaries like play around with it, but not use it in mass. But that's something that worries me, keeps me up at night to think about, how we might counter. But one item people need to think about with all of this is it used to be kind of hard for an adversary. They get onto a network, but they have to laterally move all over the place, gain all these different types of access so that they can find out what the crown jewels are, and then figure out a way to get into those different areas where the crown jewels might be on a network. A lot of organizations right now are developing in-house AI capabilities, which is great, but that means they're bringing all their valuable stuff together into one place. So it makes it easier for adversaries to identify what might be valuable. And it means that as you're developing your own AI systems, you have to think about how much more protection you're going to put around the data that's in that place, because we just don't want to make it easy for adversaries to succeed.
Wow. Well, I could ask you a million more questions, but we're reaching the end of our time. Is there anything else I missed you want to talk about, you want to plug before we call it?
Even though we talk about all of these new ways that adversaries think about to harm us, the truth is that most intrusions still happen because adversaries are able to guess passwords. There are networks that haven't patched vulnerabilities. They're able to kind of force their way in because there's not multi-factor authentication. If those got taken care of, like if those were addressed across the board, then we really could have a much bigger effect across criminals, across cyber actors, because they'd be forced to use advanced techniques. They'd be forced to use sophisticated methods. And that means when those were outed by industry, like by a company like mine, by the government, we would take away those tools. But right now they just keep adding and adding to their toolkit. So the basics still really, really matter.
And is there anything that can be done against the actors themselves?
The law enforcement intelligence communities, they've all had a lot of success in the takedowns they've done against these actors by being able to infiltrate them, being able to take down their infrastructure. They often take them down for at least a few months, and that's a few months of relief for their would-be victims. But I think we have to start asking ourselves what more we can do in terms of deterrence of the actors conducting these actions themselves. I'd hit especially on ransomware against hospitals. Are there other policy options that we can discuss, explore, that helps us stop ransomware against hospitals? I think there is. Whether I think there's a lot of harsher consequences, whether you're designating ransomware against hospitals terrorism, or you're figuring out ways to charge ransomware actors with murder if people die when there's an attack against a hospital. There's certain types of attacks by these ransomware actors that, if this isn't just crime on a computer, it's affecting people's and it's costing people lives. And I think we owe it to our communities to come up with the ways that we can tell other nations, we can tell these criminal groups, like, this is not okay. You can't do it. And there's going to be bigger consequences.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your service to the country, and good luck on this next chapter. I'm super excited for you. As you were talking through some of the cases that you worked while you were at the Bureau, I know that the rest of my creative team is going to have a heart attack when they hear some of those cases you worked, and they're going to want to reach out and talk to you for upcoming explainers and documentary projects and things. So I hope that we can reconnect sometime in the future as well, too, for other conversations.
I'd love that. And this was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Cynthia.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Private Chat by Cybernews, make sure to like and subscribe. We've got lots more cool conversations coming. Plus, we got all kinds of other cool content on the channel as well. I know you'll love. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, bye.